What's happening, filmmaking homies? My name is Cody Blue, and today we're talking about how to expose S-log2. It's your boy Cody Blue, and we're exposing S-log2. Hey! So stupid. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. As always, I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I apologize for the slight delay that I've had in my uploads. I was actually participating in a wedding out of town, and I decided for once to just not bring my camera and just kick back, relax, and enjoy the wedding without spending the whole time looking through the lens. But now we're back to our weekly uploads, and today we're talking about how to properly expose your S-log2 footage. S-log2 is an amazing camera profile for us Sony shooters because it gives us a lot more dynamic range than what we get in a standard profile, and it gives us a lot more flexibility in post when it comes to color grading. The worst part about S-log2, and probably a big reason why a lot of people don't use S-log profiles, is because you actually have to overexpose all of your footage if you want to get clean looking footage with no noise in the shadows. If you've tried S-log2 before and you weren't overexposing, you probably noticed that your shadows were incredibly noisy and you may have felt like the footage was just unusable. But again, that's because we have to actually overexpose when we're shooting, and then we'll bring that exposure back down in post to make the image look clean and clear. Now, if you haven't checked it out already, I actually have a video linked down in the description below and probably linked somewhere up here as well, where you guys can check out the exact S-log2 settings that I use to get the most out of your picture profile. Once you have those settings dialed, we can talk about how to properly expose our S-log2 footage. Now, some of you might prefer to shoot in standard S-log profiles, and these techniques will work for that as well. But obviously, I recommend using the settings that I use because they seem to work best for me, and I've really tested them out a lot to make it easy in post-production when it comes to color grading. So it's up to you if you want to use my profile or if you want to just shoot in a standard flat S-log profile. So let's go ahead and jump into some techniques that you guys can use to get proper exposure for your S-log2 footage. For those of you guys who are looking for a quick, easy, and dirty way to expose your S-log2 footage, I would recommend setting your meter to +2 before you hit that record button. This is going to give us good overexposure so that we get clean and noise-free shadows. However, it's not always the best way to expose because scenes change, and sometimes we're going to actually need to go more than +2 to get proper exposure. In most cases, setting your meter to +2 seems to get you fairly close to a proper exposure. So if you're out just running gunning and you just want to shoot super quick, +2 and you should be good to go. But for those of us who really want to take the time to get the most out of our S-log2 footage, there's a couple different techniques you guys can use to make sure you're getting the most dynamic range and the cleanest looking shadows. First off, I highly recommend you guys get yourselves an ND filter if you're not shooting with one already. If you're not shooting with an ND filter, you really should be, especially for S-log2. Not only does an ND filter allow us to get that cinematic motion blur that we're used to seeing in Hollywood films, it's also going to let us change our exposure on the fly without having to mess with any of our camera settings. I use an ND filter for every single one of my shots, and personally, I use a variable ND filter so that I can just turn the front element of my camera in order to adjust my exposure. So I turn the element, keeping an eye on my zebras to see that my exposure is dialed, and then I don't have to touch any camera settings and I'm good to go. So if you don't already have an ND filter, go out and get one. I highly recommend it, and it's really gonna help you expose your S-log2 footage. Once you've got your ND filter on and your camera settings dialed, exposing S-log2 is actually pretty easy. And the technique that I like to use is using the in-camera zebras to check my exposure. So first, what we're gonna wanna do is go into our camera settings, go into the zebra settings, and set a custom zebra with a lower limit of 107+. Basically, what this is going to do is it's going to tell our camera to show us zebras for any IRE value that's 107 and above. But why do we care about 107 IRE? Basically, anything that's 107 IRE or above when we're shooting S-log2 is going to be completely blown out. So these are the highlights that we're talking about, and this means that they're going to be completely white, and we're not going to be able to recover them when we go into post-production. So we can use these zebras to tell us exactly what's getting blown out when we're shooting S-log2, and we can use this information to help us get a proper exposure and help us prevent blowing out our highlights. Now, depending on your scenario, there are going to be some cases where we have to let those highlights blow out. While we do get a lot of dynamic range when we're shooting S-log2, in some special cases, such as when your subject is in a shadow and your background is really bright, we're gonna have to blow out those highlights if we wanna get enough detail in our shadows so that they don't have any noise and they look clean and clear. When it comes to exposing S-log2, our main priority is going to be to make sure that our shadows are overexposed enough so that when we go into post, we can bring that exposure down and they won't have any noise. But don't worry about overexposing because we have a lot of dynamic range to work with. A lot of the times you're going to be able to recover those highlights and you're going to get a cleaner and better looking image when it comes to color grading. So when it comes to properly exposing S-log2, I'll dial my exposure all the way up until I start to see some zebras in my highlights, and then I'm going to dial it back down just a tiny bit until I don't have any zebras in my image whatsoever. This tells me that my image is properly exposed, and I know I'll be able to recover all of my highlight details in post. So you can see in some of the footage that I'm showing you guys now, a before and after of what my exposure looked like straight out of the camera, and then after what it actually looks like once the footage has been color graded. You'll notice that none of our highlights are blown out and there's no noise in the shadows because we properly exposed and then we brought that exposure back down in post. Now in these next couple clips, I'm going to show you guys what I consider challenging lighting, where our subject is in a shadow and they have a really bright background behind them. And these are some of those cases where we're gonna have to let our highlights blow out in order to get proper exposure in our shadows. Now in these clips, I'm showing you guys a before where I've actually tried to color in where you might see zebras when you're looking at the back of your camera. And then on the after, I've color graded the footage and you can see that the highlights are a little bit blown out, but our shadows still look really good and clean and clear, and our exposure overall looks pretty good. These, again, are just some instances where I couldn't get a good exposure on my subject unless I blew out those highlights. So it's really up to you as a filmmaker in these challenging situations to determine when and where to allow your highlights to blow out. For most typical cases where you have pretty even exposure and nothing is incredibly bright, you can pull that exposure all the way up until you see those zebras and then dial it back down just a tiny bit so that you don't see any zebras at all. And this is going to tell you that you have a pretty good overexposure for your S-log footage. Now it might look pretty bright on your screen when you're out shooting, but don't worry, as long as you don't see those 107 IRE zebras, you can be confident that your highlights aren't blowing out and you'll be able to recover them in post. So I'll show you guys a couple more examples with a before and after so that you guys can get an idea of how I'm exposing my footage and how I'm bringing that exposure back down in post. Now for this video, I was really struggling trying to get my point across because I really wanted to show you guys the back of my screen with my zebras peeking so you can see exactly how I'm determining where to place my zebras. Unfortunately, the brightness on the Sony cameras just isn't bright enough for me to record my screen while I'm out in a bright scenario with zebras peeking on my camera. So hopefully this video makes sense to you guys. You just dial your exposure up until you see those zebras and then dial it back down just a tiny bit and then you'll know you have a pretty good exposure. In some cases, however, don't forget to let your highlights blow out in order to get good exposure in your shadows. If you do have any specific questions, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the comments, so I'll be checking back and trying to answer your questions as soon as I can. A lot of you guys have actually been sending me questions on Instagram, which I think is super awesome, and I get those notifications directly to my phone. So if you want to ask me a question and make sure that I saw your question, hit me up on Instagram at CodyBlue_. Feel free to send me any questions you guys might have, and I'll try my best to answer every single one of them. All right, everybody. Well, that's it for me. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope this helps you understand how to properly expose your S-log2 footage. As always, make sure to like this video if you like it and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm stoked to get back to the weekly uploads and I really hope you guys enjoy the content that I'm bringing to you. Like I said before, if you do have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below or message me on Instagram. I always check those notifications and I try to reply to every single message that you guys are sending me. As always, let me know down in the comments below what other videos you guys would like to see. I really appreciate you tuning in and we'll see you in the next one.